you're playing DFS this week, you're in the right place. This video will tell you who exactly to play, but more importantly, the players to avoid that others don't know about. And we can start with Josh Jacobs at $8,100, and honestly, that's a steep price tag for Josh Jacobs. So do we want to play him as a favorite this week versus the Patriots? Well, as my tweet references right here, this season as a favorite, Josh Jacobs is averaging over 23 touches per game, basically 20 fantasy points per game, and 113 yards per game. Yeah, that would do really well at this price point if he just hits his average. And last week, the Patriots gave up 114 total yards to be exact to James Conner, who in my opinion is nowhere near as good as Josh Jacobs. So I actually think Jacobs is worth the price tag this week, coming in around 10 to 12% owned in the DFS blueprint. Now at the quarterback position, we end up having Justin Herbert, who's $7,200. And look, this dude has dealt with injuries all season long on his offensive line and his receiving core, but the receivers returned this week. And it led to an elite game for Herbert, who had 367 yards, over 22 fantasy points, threw 51 times. He now has 47 or more attempts in 3 straight games. That's what happens when your defense isn't solid. He's top 20 fantasy points on DraftKings in 4 straight games. He's been good. And this week he faces the Tennessee Titans, who are solid against the run, but as you can see right here, they've given up the second most passing yards on the year. They're just 19 behind the Vikings for giving up the most on the season. Okay, so it's understood that Herbert looks like a good play, but what about his pass catchers? You see, finally, these guys are healthy with Mike Williams returning last week, Keenan Allen returning a couple weeks ago, but which one would you prefer here, Sal? Well, let's answer it. First off, there's Keenan Allen, who if we look at his targets this season, they've been fantastic since he's been getting healthier. 14 targets in back-to-back weeks for the kid. I say kid jokingly as he's about to turn 31 years old, but even at 31 years old, he's still top 20 at getting open versus man coverage. That is encouraging, and honestly, it's rare. He'll operate out of the slot and see a lot of Amani Hooker, who allows a 76% catch rate to wide receivers. That's a good spot for Keenan Allen. Then there's Mike Williams, who's only limited to 67% of the snaps instead of 90% plus last week returning from injury. But that didn't stop him for popping off for a top 5 wide receiver performance of over 100 yards and a touchdown on 6 targets. And now he has 28 pounds over every single cornerback from the Titans. The takeaway here is that both of these guys are great options. Honestly, you should probably stack them both with Herbert if you can afford it, but if I had to choose one, it would be the explosive upside of Mike Williams. Now, speaking of upside, Amon-Ra St. Brown continues to produce even in a difficult matchup. Last week, he didn't pop off for you, but he had a solid game. However, we considered him a fade last week because he was the highest owned wide receiver, and that wasn't a good matchup. That was with a 28-point team total. Now, this week, Amon-Ra's team total is just 22.75. It's 5+ points less than last week, so not as good of a game environment, facing the Jets secondary that ranks 2nd in the NFL, expecting to see some Sauce Gardner. And Gardner just might be not only the best rookie cornerback, the best overall cornerback in the league this season. Again, Amon-Ra is an ownership fade for me, according to the DFS blueprint, where he's coming in around 15% owned. Back to the running back position, what do we want to do at $6,300 David Montgomery? He's a tricky call because on one hand, the fellow without Khalil Herbert in 3 games is averaging 100 yards per game, that's total yards, and over 17 fantasy points per game. He's been fantastic. But he's now a 9-point underdog versus solid Eagles run defense. So what do we do here? Well, as a big underdog this year of 7+ points in 5 games, he's still averaging over 14 points per game, and he's seeing more targets without Herbert, 4 per game. So even though the Bears are big underdogs this week, they still rely on the run, and he's seeing a big enough role that I think Montgomery's a solid play here at lower ownership around just 8%. Okay, so that's one veteran running back. Let's go to another veteran running back who's like the ancient veteran running back at 33 years old, and Latavius Murray, who last week, look, he wasn't good. He had 11 total touches, led this backfield, but only 31 total yards. He's been extremely inefficient, but he still had 10 fantasy points in 5 out of 7 games this year because of a lack of competition. And Mike Boone, who was expected to take touches away from him, just got hurt and placed on IR. So now his only competition is Marlon Mack, who has like 6 touches this year. So even though Murray is extremely inefficient, outside the top 50 in yards created per touch, he faces a Cardinals team that is bottom 5 in run defense, and he's going to see all the work as a favorite this week. He is a sneaky leverage play because nobody wants to play him, but you should. And trust me, it's gross to recommend him, but that honestly means he's probably even that much better of a play. Sticking at the running back position, you have a $6,900 James Conner. Now, do we want to actually play this guy? Look, when he's been healthy, he's been fantastic. Over his last 4 games, when he's been healthy, averaging nearly 100 yards per game, 21 fantasy points per game on over 22 touches per game. He has absolutely no competition in this backfield either. Now, the problem is his quarterback is Colt McCoy. They're expected to just score 17 points, the least on the slate, so that's not a good game environment. And he's coming in as a top 3 owned running back versus a top 10 run defense in Denver. For me personally, James Conner this week, he's a fade, he's an avoid. Okay, well, what about a wide receiver in a similar price range with Mike Williams at $6,200, who's a slight underdog this week, which should lead to some more passing volume for the Buccaneers. Mike Williams has been up and down this season. The ups are that against man coverage, he's a top 20 wide receiver at earning targets, pretty good. But the downs are that overall, he ranks 51st in earning targets amongst wide receivers. Now, there's some reasons for this. Defenses are playing more too high safeties, which are leading to more checkdowns naturally, and Tom Brady this year is checking the ball down a lot more. He does not want to be hit at all this season. He's quick to get rid of the ball. So that leads to less targets for Mike Evans, but he's still seeing 8.2 targets per game and a lot of cheat code targets. As you can see right here, he's top 5 in deep targets this year, and he has a 30+ pound advantage on every single one one of the cornerbacks that he's going to be facing this week from the Cincinnati Bengals. So at just like 3 or 4% owned, I actually think Mike Williams is a nice leverage play. Now, this next player will be higher owned, so does that make him a good or a bad play? $6,500 Chris Olave, the wide receiver one for the New Orleans Saints. Is this a fair price tag? Well, he'll face Atlanta, who he faced week 1 on a limited role in his first ever game as a rookie. He faced AJ Terrell, 3 catches, 40 yards. But again, we can't take much from that. He didn't even play a full set of snaps. In this matchup, he'll see some AJ Terrell on the outside, who's been good this year. He's been up and down at times, but good as of late. But he'll also see Darren Hall for about half the game, who's allowing a 74% catch rate. And that's where these big plays can come from Olave. Because reminder, Olave is 3rd in the NFL, even though he's missed some time this year in deep targets. That's where it comes from. That's where I think we want to play Olave, who is picking up some ownership, but not enough. So we've talked a lot of running back, a lot of wide receivers, some quarterback. What about the tight ends? Well, I want to signal in on $4,400 Dalton Schultz, who appears to be back. A lot of people took him in the 5th and 6th round of their fantasy drafts, and they're finally getting that guy. Because if we look at his snap count, in week 5, he played 20% of the snaps because he was injured, but then he started to work his way back. He was limited playing just 69, 68% of the snaps, 65% of the snaps. It wasn't until about a couple of weeks ago that he started to see his full snaps, 84, 80, and 93. Now, this 93% of the snaps was his most since week 1, and it led to 10 targets. But what I find the most interesting is his route rate, how much he was out there for a passing play. In the past, when he wasn't healthy, it was like 50%, 57%. Lately, 81% and 75%. That's why you're seeing the targets come up to 16 total targets, 6 and 10 the last 2 weeks. So play Dalton Schultz, but do we want to play another Cowboys pass catcher? And that's CeeDee Lamb, who's $7,300. And by all accounts, honestly, this is probably too cheap for Lamb. But the Cowboys are almost touchdown favorites versus a bottom 10 team against the run in the Jaguars. And this is a Cowboys team that would love to throw the ball just 25 times and run a lot. So even though CeeDee Lamb has been great this year, averaging 9 targets per game, top 5 in the NFL, this is a situation where I think Dak throws just 30 times, and Lamb is the 2nd highest owned wide receiver this week. I think we can find better spots for upside. He's a fade. Now we can pivot back to the quarterback position. There's an expensive guy here. It's Patrick Mahomes, but look, he has the highest team total on the slate at 31 points, 3 more than any other team, as he faces the Houston Texans, who rank 31st in coverage. Now, the Texans don't give up a lot of total points to quarterbacks because they're usually trailing in the second half and teams are running the ball against them, but that's not what the Chiefs do. The Chiefs have led in a lot of second halves, and that does not stop them from throwing, as Mahomes is averaging over 39 attempts per game, top 3 in the NFL. It's just absolutely nuts. So who do we want to play with Mahomes? Ideally, Travis Kelce, but he's $7,800, over $3,000 more than any other tight end on the slate. Well, is he worth it? Well, Kelce's going to face the Texans linebackers, who he has 15 plus pounds over each of them, so that's nice. He'll face primarily Kirksey, who's allowed a 69% catch rate to tight ends this year. This is a good spot, the best spot on the entire week, actually, for just so happens to be the best tight end as well. And let's not forget just how good he's been, leading all tight ends in red zone targets and 5th in deep targets. He has 36 cheat code targets on the year. Yeah, you're playing Travis Kelce even at this price tag. But how the heck can you afford Mahomes and Travis Kelce? Well, you stack up another cheap option from the Chiefs. And it's a disgusting name to say and recommend, but $3,800 MVS, the former Green Bay Packer, is the guy I want to go to, because look at this. Still out there running the routes. After seeing a dip and only playing 55% of the passing snaps, he went back up to 77% this past game. Now, he hasn't top 10 fantasy points in 5 weeks, and he hasn't top 15 points on the entire season, but he still ranks top 20 in the NFL in routes run, meaning he's always on the field with Patrick Mahomes in this offense with over a 31-point team total. He's cheap enough that I'll take a flyer here and hope for a big play to hit. He has 13 deep targets on the season. Now, if you didn't want to go to MVS for a value, there is a guy on the opposite side of this game, and it's a little bit of a scenario here. We can start with Nico Collins, who's $4,300. Now, he hasn't been practicing to open the week. If he plays, I like him. In his last game, he saw a career-high 11 targets. If he doesn't play, that's where Chris Moore starts to come in the exact same price tag after he posted 11 targets last week. But that's not all, because if Nico Collins and Brandon Cooks, who he's expected to miss, if they indeed miss this game, there's also going to be the veteran Philip Dorsett and a younger player who's been seeing more usage, recently cut by the Packers, Amari Rodgers. Now, these dudes aren't great plays, but they're about $3,000 flat, and they make that Mahomes plus Kelce stack, maybe even throw Juju in there. They make it work. And speaking of make it work, a cheap running back can also do that for you. There's a $5,300 Donovan Knight here, but do we want him in what seems to be a surprisingly difficult matchup? Yeah, the Lions about 2 or 3 months ago were a terrible run defense, but as of late, the past month of the season, they've held Saquon to 22 yards, Etienne to 54, and Dalvin Cook just a week ago in a good game environment to just 23 rushing yards. But Donovan Knight over the last 3 weeks has been better than all 3 of those running backs. Believe it or not, the number 2 graded PFF running back, breaking the 2nd most tackles over that time and averaging over 15 fantasy points per game, as you can see right here. Now, he's still technically splitting snaps with Michael Carter, but he's earning all the touches after getting 19 more last last week, and all they're doing is raving about him. How could you not, as he's going downhill with speed, breaking tackles, and picking up yardage, hence his 13-yard touchdown run last week. So I think Zonovan Knight is worth the start at 5,300, but if you wanted a different running back who's coming in slightly lower owned, there's $5,400 Deonta Foreman, who I actually think he's a play this week. You see, in 5 close games this year, Foreman's averaging over 110 yards per game and 23.5 touches per game. 23.5 touches would rank top 2 in the NFL amongst running backs. And this week, the Titans are 2.5-point favorites, and Chuba Hubbard is still out there, but last week it didn't matter. Hubbard put up a good game, but it was still Foreman seeing 11 more snaps than Hubbard. It just so happened that Hubbard was efficient last week. That's not going to happen every single week. Foreman's still the guy that I want to play here. Now, I also want to play this prop. Sam Darnold, I want him over 172.5 yards. That's kind of a foreshadowing of what's to come about a Carolina Panthers player. And then we talked about David Montgomery. I want him over 53.5 rushing yards. I combine these two. I used prizepicks.com to take these, and you, because of the beautiful people on PrizePicks during the holiday season, can get a free bet. More specifically, a free bet up to $100. You put in $27, you get 27 right back. You put in $100 Rooskies, you get 100 right back when you use the code SAL22. SAL22, link in the description below on prizepicks.com. Go ahead and tail this and take some other ones as well. And now we head back to the quarterback position. $6,000 Trevor Lawrence was the highest scoring player on the slate last week at the position, and now his price tag and his ownership are coming up. But his team total has dropped, and now he faces a Cowboys top 5 secondary and top 5 pass rush, a totally different matchup. And because of this brutal spot and not as good of a game environment, I'm actually fading Lawrence, who at a higher price tag and higher ownership is not as good of a play. But how about Joe Burrow, who's $1,000 more at $7,000 flat? He has some wide receiver injuries. We'll see if they play. They're practicing earlier in the week, but he also has Jamar Chase healthy. Now, obviously, if T. Higgins and Tyler Boyd miss, Jamar Chase is the guy to stack here. But if all 3 of these guys end up playing between T. Higgins, Jamar Chase, and Boyd, what's the preference? Well, the Bengals play the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and this is the matchups for Jamar Chase and really all of these wide receivers. Carlton Davis is actually going to be the best matchup for Jamar Chase because of this right here. He's the slowest cornerback on this team. So just straight speed, where Jamar Chase often wins for those deep balls and those big explosive plays, he's the slowest guy, and he'll actually see the most Jamar Chase. Good for Chase. And then there's T. Higgins, who has a 20-pound advantage on every single one of these cornerbacks, also has a 3-inch size advantage. That's good for Higgins. And then Boyd has a nice matchup against Bunning Murphy, who's allowing over an 80% catch rate to slot wide receivers. And Hayden Hurst is expected to miss more usage in the middle of the field for Boyd. So if I had to rank it based on the price tag, based on the upside, based on the ownership, I'd actually rank it T. Higgins, Jamar Chase, and Tyler Boyd in that order. I am not afraid to play any of those dudes, just track their injury status. But I might be afraid, maybe not, we'll see momentarily, to play the running back on this team, Joe Mixon, at $7,200. Now, he's facing a poor bottom 10 Buccaneers run defense, but they don't allow a lot of success to fantasy running backs. As you can see from my tweet right here, even though they're not great at stopping the run in terms of per carry yardage, they're allowing the 4th fewest receptions to running backs and just 6 rushing TDs, only 5 to RBs this year. So for Mixon to get there, he probably has to have one of these 120-yard rushing games, because he's not going to have many receptions, and he's probably not going to find the end zone the way that the Buccaneers give defense and the way that they funnel it to running backs. So for a guy coming in around 10 to 12% owned, I'm just going to fade him and choose other players in this price range. All right, next up is DJ Moore. Boy, oh boy, a $5,300 number 1 wide receiver, and yet last week on 3 targets, he puts up 0.6 points, the least points out of any player that accumulated any points last week. But let's not forget, just a week before that, he was a top 10 wide receiver on the week, popping off in his first game back with Sam Darnold. And now he faces a Steelers team that allows the 4th most points to fantasy wide receivers and the 5th most yards to wide receivers this year. Very quietly, great matchup for a number 1 receiver on a team with that much talent at just $5,300. Yeah, I want DJ Moore. And I'm also getting questions about this quarterback, $5,700 Jared Goff against the Jets. Now, Goff last week was a number 3 quarterback on the week. He looked great, 3 touchdowns, over 300 yards, and he paid off for a lot of people when he was highly owned. Because of this success, he's increasing his ownership, but his price point is increasing, and everything else is getting worse. His team total has dropped nearly 6 points, and now he faces a number 2 secondary as opposed to a bottom 5 secondary in the Vikings last week, a number 2 secondary that includes Sauce Gardner of the Jets. So in a worse situation at a higher price tag and higher ownership, I'm fading Jared Goff. Now back to tight end, because there's a $4,300 tight end I have to talk about, and it's Gerald Everett, who's seeing his role grow. You see, last week he played 72% of the snaps against Miami. That was his most snaps since week 3. This led to 8 targets on a very strong 35 routes. The amount that he's out there on passing plays as well is increasing. And it's perfect timing, because now he faces the Titans, who allow the 2nd most yards to the tight end position, about 100 more than the next closest team, the Jacksonville Jaguars. And speaking of the Jaguars, what in the world do we do with Travis Etienne, whose price point is dropping? He's just $6,000 flat, and he's honestly not picking up that much ownership. It's just been a roller coaster for Etienne. The middle of the season was great once James Robinson left, left, but since then, a blowout against Kansas City, didn't have usage. Then the bye week. Then he gets hurt. Then against a improving Detroit run defense, doesn't do much. Last week in a tough matchup, doesn't do much. So he's seen tough matchups and injuries and blowouts. But there are 3 reasons why things are turning around. He's still playing around 80% of the snaps. That's number 1. Number 2 is the Cowboys aren't the greatest against the run, bottom 10 in the NFL. And number 3 is on paper, this game shouldn't blow out as they're just 4-point underdogs, and the Cowboys kept it close, almost lost last week to the worst team in the league in the Texans. So things are turning around at lower ownership and a lower price tag for ETN. I think he's actually a really nice leverage play. And speaking of leverage plays, if you want to see all the leverage plays on this slate, that means players who are lower owned than they should be based on their ownership and their projection. If you want to see that and a whole lot more, everything you need to win and stop losing in DFS for this week, start winning those dollar rooskies right around the holiday season, well, check out the DFS blueprint link down below on Patreon. And in that blueprint, you'll gain access to all the tools I use every single week in DFS and that thousands of other people are using right now to win more. So check it out, and best of luck on this Sunday slate, you beautiful people.